right, we're back. We're going to get into Genesis day number 5 here, about God remaking everything. And we've seen the need for that. And He's making everything here in Genesis chapter 1 for a specific purpose. And that purpose is going to bring life onto the earth. And He's going to start with animal creation here in Genesis chapter 1, day number 5. We turn over to Genesis chapter 1, verse 20. We're going to enter day 5 here. Day 5. But in Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, we're going to see God now. He's got the earth there. He's got the vegetation growing. He's got the sun and the planets that are there to bless the earth and to help it and to sustain the earth. And now He can bring life. You see, God, before He does anything, He makes sure everything's in place to sustain what He wants to do. He doesn't create life on day 1 and then make the vegetation and the sun and everything after that, because by the time you get there, that life probably could have died. So He does everything, He preps everything first. And He's prepped the earth just perfectly. So now He can do something in verse 20. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and the fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters and the sea, and let the fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day." So in the 5th day here, we see God's going to now create some things. And you see here, in verse 20, "Let the waters bring forth." He's going to get some things out of the waters. And He's going to call these the moving creatures. And verse 21, "And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth." That word "create" there, that's the first time this word pops up since Genesis 1:1. In Genesis 1:1, we saw in the beginning God created. And now here, it's not until we get to verse 21 where we see God creates again. And we're going to see there's a difference, and we're going to take a couple minutes and talk about this. There's a difference between the word create and the word made. Up until now, God has been making things. He's been making the stars. Drop back down in verse 16. And God made some things. And God made 2 great lights. And He makes the stars, and He makes the sun, and He makes the moon. And we're going to see there's a difference between made and create. And this is important. And the Scriptures differentiate between these two terms. And we're going to talk about these for just a moment now, and then we'll see in a couple lessons further down why it's even more important. But we see here God's going to create life. He's going to create it. And so what's the difference? The word "made," we use that all the time. We make things. Now when you make things, like when I was a kid, I'd make a model race car, and I'd take the pieces and put them together. When you make something, you're using material and you're making something with it. Okay? You're using pre-existing material. And that's how the Scriptures define made or make. And it's like when we get over to Adam. He's going to make Adam. Well, what He's going to do, He's going to take dirt and He's going to form it into the shape of a body. And then He's going to create Adam by breathing life into it. And we'll see that in a little bit. But the word "made" has to do with taking pre-existing material and putting it together. Like when He made the sun and the stars. The molecules were already out there. See, everything was created in the beginning. All matter was created in Genesis 1:1. That matter came out of nothing. And when God made the stars, He took those molecules that were already created in Genesis 1:1, and He put them together, and He formed the sun, and then He formed the moon and all the other stars. Now the word "create" is it gives you a different view of how God put something together. And the word "create" means He made something out of nothing. Where you put, when I made a model car, I had to have the pieces. But God can create a model car. He can create that because He can bring into existence the car out of nothing. Do you see the difference? Mm-hmm. It's like here when He's talking about the animal life. And he's talking about life here. God has to create life. Because there was no life to give that was in existence that God can draw from and give it to the animal creation. Okay, so there's a big difference here. And it's really neat how your scripture, your Bible, differentiates between these words so you can have a greater appreciation for what God's doing. So when God says he's going to create life, well, first he's going to form these whales and seas and fish and birds and stuff out of the waters. So he's going to take pre-existing material, put it together and form. But then he's going to create the life and animate that. That's why you see here, by the time you get to day 5, verse 21, and God created great whales and every living creature. He's created. See, we've gone through, turn over to Psalms 89. We went through some of this a little earlier when we looked at the beginning. And remember when in the beginning, God created. He had to create everything because there was nothing there for him to work with out of eternity. And one of the things he created was the north and south. In Psalms 89, verse 12. The north and south, thou hast created them. You see that word create there? That's because when God first started to create the heaven, there was nothing there. And therefore he had to create the north and the south because there was nothing to pull from. Okay, he didn't make the north and south. He created them. It's different. There's a difference. And we really see that. Come over to Ephesians chapter 4. This is when this is why it's important to understand what the words mean. Ephesians chapter 4. Side note here, but when we all know we're sinners, God says there's no good thing within us. Our flesh is corrupted and ruined by sin. I was with some people the other day, and they were a little older, and their bodies are falling apart. Their fingers are gnarled, and they can't walk very good, and it's just hard to do things. And it's because sin's in those bodies, and it's corrupting them. It's destroying them. And we know man has an issue with sin too, that has brought death upon us and separated us from God. And we need to be saved. And when we're saved, God does something new with us. He makes us a new creature. We're not going to go into all this, but I want to talk about this just from this aspect. God has to create something new in you. Turn over to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 24. When you get saved, there's a new inner man in you. Verse 24, that God instructs that ye put on the new man, which after God is what? Created in righteousness and true holiness. The new man inside you, God creates out of nothing. God doesn't take, when you get saved, God doesn't take parts of your old nature or parts of your flesh and reconstitute it and make something new. He creates something new. He leaves everything in the past, and he creates something brand new that's not stained by the old. You see that? How that's really, it's just wonderful what God does for you. How he creates something new in you called the inner man. And that inner man came from nothing. God gave it life, and he creates it not from your old man, not from pieces of your flesh or anything that's brought over. It's brand new. And it's from nothing. Therefore, he uses the word creates. He creates. See, therefore, which is created in righteousness and true holiness. Turn over to, let's go back to Genesis now. So the difference between these two words may seem minute, but it's really large. So when you see the word made in Scripture, it's always from pre-existing material. That's why, when people say these are the 7 days of creation, they're really not right. It's really not correct. Because day 5 is the first day we hit some creation. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, he's been doing things amongst existing material. He really hasn't created anything. He's made a lot of things, but he hasn't created anything. And this again is further proof that Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, when God created all things, that was a different, separate time period amongst itself that we've been talking about, where the angels were created back then, and Lucifer fell, and sin entered, and all that happened back there. And what God's doing in these days of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is reconstituting, and now that he's reconstituted something, he's going to create life and put it in there. So Genesis, we see this in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. God makes a clear distinction between these two words. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he hath rested from all his work which God, what? Created and made. See, God makes a clear distinction between the two. There are some things God made, and then there are some things God created. And now that you understand that, hopefully you're like, wow, that's sort of neat. You know, even though it might seem minor and, you know, minuscule, it's sort of neat how God distinguishes between the two. And when you think about, you know, go back to your new inner man, God personally created that for you. Just for you. And just as God creates life here in Genesis, that inner man gives you what? Life. Anytime life comes into existence, that's God's creating. Because there's nothing, you can't make life out of material objects. You can't. You know, evolutionists think life can come from, you know, lightning, and, you know, you get a mixture of chemicals, and you give it enough time, the premortal soup, and you're going to get some life. No, that's not true. Life can only come from God. And God has to create it when he gives it. Because there's nothing he can draw from to make it in the material world. So we see the difference there between create and made. So let's go back a page to Genesis now, chapter 1, verse 20, when we talk about these creatures. And God's going to give life. And let the waters bring forth the moving creature that hath life. We're going to see God gives life now. Where does that life come from? God, exactly. Can only come from God. Turn over to John chapter 14. John chapter 14. Verse 6. Jesus talking about himself. Jesus said unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Jesus says he is the life. Life is found only in God. You cannot find life outside of God anywhere. See, that's the problem man has when they try and think of how life began. Because they don't want to start with God, so they try and, the dilemma is, where did life come from? It's hard enough for them to come up with a reasoning of where did the material world come from, and how that came into place. But even harder on top of that is, where did life come from? You know, it's one thing to have material. You can have objects. But then to have it have life is a whole nother step. And they don't know how life came. They think it's, like I was saying, electricity. They get that from Frankenstein. You know, who wrote that? Shelby was way ahead of her time when she said, that's like, you know, she said. Try saying that 10 times fast. Mm-hmm. Speaking of making up words, the other night we were coming back, and I was saying somebody was trying to be funny, and I said, you know, they should have tried to say it funnily. You know, try to say something funnily. And I turned to Laura and I said, is that even a word, funnily? You know, it's like an adjective to describe something, but it should be a word.
It is.
It is funnily? Funnily.
Funny is a word.
Yeah, not funny though. You try to say something funnily. Oh well, that should be a word. Anyway, that, you know, it's sort of crazy. She said, okay, God said here, what were we talking about?
You made a new word.
Yes, I just created a new word.
No, you made it. You didn't create it.
Oh, I made a new word, exactly. So, he's going to create life here with these sea creatures, and he's going to impart life to them. And, what am I trying to get at here? Okay, the living creature. What is life? Life only comes from God. But what does life allow things to do? God calls it, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature. the moving. Moving has to do with life in the animal kingdom. Okay? When God created vegetation, vegetation does not move. A tree cannot pick up its roots and move over here when it wants to. Okay? Flowers cannot just say one day, you know, it looks sunny over there, let's all get up and go over there. Okay? Flowers move by seeds, but they don't willingly move. The vegetation creation is at the mercy of the earth to move it. Okay? Birds can move seeds. The wind can drive plant material. But plant material in itself does not move on its own. Does not have that volition. Cannot pull its roots up out of the earth and say, I'm going to move over here today. And then the next day pull its roots up and go. See, because that doesn't have the type of life that God's going to give. See, when God talks about life, it talks about you being able to move on your own volition. Therefore, he calls it here the moving creature that hath life. And the fowl that may fly, those birds are going to be able to move. A bird can move from place to place. Cattle can roam from pasture to pasture. You see that? A fish can swim from one part of the ocean to another part of the ocean. They can move, and that's how God's going to define this type of life he's going to create. It's going to be the moving creature. And he's going to start in the sea. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life. He's going to start to make sea creatures. Well, these are like the fish. Crabs and everything that lives in the sea. Shrimp and seahorses and everything else that he makes. He makes them, but he also creates them when he gives them life. So, that's what he's doing here. He starts to fill the sea with these creatures that he makes, and he gives them life, and that they can do things on their own. And he makes the birds. He makes the fowl. And they are to fly, in the end of verse 20, in the open firmament of heaven. Remember when we talked about how God created the universe, and how the heavens now are separated? And you got the earth here, and you got the third heaven up here, and this is the second and the first here, and the second is surrounded by a hard shell. You can't get out of it really, other than through some doors and some windows. But between the first, the atmosphere of the earth, and the atmosphere of the second heaven, you can go through that. That's why it's the open firmament, and the birds are to fly in the open firmament, and that's where we see them. They fly out there. So he creates the sea creatures and the fowl. And he says, verse 21, and God created great whales. He specifies the whales here because the whales are like these massive creatures out there. And as we see those, we can say, God even made that. I remember as a kid having seen some of those pictures of a whale, and they put the man next to it, and he's like this big, and the whale's like this big. And it's just, wow, it's just a wondrous thing. God says, I even made that. Just so you guys know. That moveth. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth. He created everything that moves. After their kind. He says everything is after their kind. And we saw that come up with the vegetation. The vegetation world is after its kind. A tree will always be a tree. Corn will always be corn. It never becomes a cucumber. And it's the same thing in the animal kingdom. A whale will always be a whale. A dolphin will always be a dolphin. They don't become one or the other like, people try and imagine, different fish grow up and become different things. And that's not how it works. And, genetics and DNA prove all this. That's how it is. Everything is after its kind. And every winged fowl after its kind. The birds are the same way. You don't have one type of bird becoming another type of bird. Once you're born that type, that's what you are. They can't reproduce other types. Everything is after its kind. And that's just how it is. And God looks at all this and he says, it's good. You see in the end of verse 21 there? And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." In the morning, in the evening, and the morning were the fifth day. Verse 22 is interesting. God talks to them. This is the first time God speaks to his creation. I mean, he's been speaking all along, but now he's going to have some personal communication. And the reason he does is because now there's some life there that God can talk to on a personal basis. God can speak to the animals. God can speak to things with life. And he talks to them, and he tells them, "Be fruitful and multiply." You see, when God created the animal's life, he created them mature. Okay? He didn't create a baby fish, and the earth was covered by mature vegetation. Is how he made it. Okay? Now when he does these things, he makes them mature. And so that's what he's doing here. So now he talks to them. And he says he blesses them. God blessed them. You know how God blesses today? He blesses by speaking. If God didn't speak, the animal creation here wouldn't know really what to do. Anytime God speaks to you is a blessing. Because it means you don't have to think of it on your own. The whole word here is a blessing to you. It's God's words to you. It's meant to bless you. And God blesses these creatures, and what's he tell them? Be fruitful and multiply. He tells them to reproduce. Have babies. Have whales, have baby whales. Dolphins, have baby dolphins. Crabs, have baby crabs. And he tells them to multiply. And to fill the waters of the sea. To fill them up. See, the waters were empty at that time. And God says, go fill them. And isn't it fascinating? And you know what's really neat? These creatures obeyed God. They did. They started to multiply, and they started to move around, and they started to fill all the waters. Because what do you find today?
Lots of fish.
Lots of fish, and they're everywhere. There's not a lake, stream, or ocean where you don't find animal life. They obeyed God. These creatures. They were obedient to him to multiply and fill. Wouldn't it be great if man was only as obedient as the animal creation? But we're not. We're going to see that in a little bit. When God told, after, Noah and stuff, God told them to go fill the earth again. We'll get into that a little bit later. But that man didn't. Man tried to band together, and they built the Tower of Babel. Remember that? They were disobedient to God's commandment to fill the earth. And man tried to huddle together and do some things there, and God ended up having to come down and create languages and separate everybody out. But the animal creation is obedient. They multiply and they fill now. And they leave, and they go out there and they start to populate this earth that God created. And the earth right then was in a perfect condition to sustain life. And it was there to sustain all these animals that God had just made. So we come to the end of it. And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. So by the end of day 5, we have the earth now being populated by sea creatures, and we have birds starting to fly around. And then he's going to come into day 6. And day 6 is going to be the capstone of creation. Because he's going to create a very unique creature called man. And we'll do that in our next lesson. Okay, thanks. We can turn that up. I'll take a break for a second. What?